So, welcome to this edition of the Spoken Review. Today, we are going to talk about Firepower: How Weapons Shaped Warfare by Paul Lockhart. Now, Paul Lockhart is a professor of history at Wright State University, where it says he has taught military and European history for more than 30 years. His book is really about military innovations that completely changed the face of warfare over the last 1,000 years or so, ranging all the way from the beginning, from medieval times, or let's say mid-medieval times, about 1,000 or 1,200 AD, all the way through the end of World War II. And that by itself makes the book quite interesting for military history buffs and military technology buffs. He talks about everything from gunpowder and cannon, all the way through rifles and muskets, all the way through better explosive charges and incendiary charges, um, right up to World War II, where he stops at the end talking about fighters and bombers. But if the book were just about these innovations, it would still be of limited interest. What I think makes the book fascinating is Lockhart's discussion of how all this military hardware really had a transformational impact on the economic and political systems of the countries in which it was developed, and how, in turn, the politics and economics of those countries really influenced the development of all this military hardware. He starts his book talking, not surprisingly, about gunpowder, which was the first and, in many ways, the greatest military technological innovation. Gunpowder, as we all know, was famously invented in China, and then it made its way into Europe. We don't know exactly when or how. But once gunpowder appeared on the scene, it very quickly led to the development in the 13th and 14th centuries of cannon. And cannon really turned out to have a tremendous, in fact, a seminal impact, not just on specific battles and wars, but also on the social and political order of the day. They were used widely, they were used during the Crusades. Much later, they were used by the Ottomans to take over so much of the territory in Europe. And he talks about how cannons evolved from breech loading cannons. The breech is the part of the cannon that's closest to the person firing the cannon, to muzzle loading cannons, where you put the cannonball and the gunpowder through the muzzle on the top and then aim the cannon and fire it. Amusingly enough, this is the opposite of the development of handheld weapons, including pistols and rifles and so on, where at first they were muzzle loading rifles, like muskets, for instance. And then came the advent of breech loading rifles and breech loading guns. Cannons, of course, were very important for breaking down the defenses of a fortress, literally reducing it to ruins in many cases. And he cites some famous examples of battles where cannons were in fact decisive. But what I found, keeping in line with this more generalized view of military innovation that I mentioned, what I found more fascinating was his description of how cannon weakened the authority of the knights and the nobility of Europe. The nobility that had until then kept the social order and the political order, the nobility that in fact held great influence over the social hierarchy of the countryside. That nobility in the form of knights was really concentrated in the castles. And when castles started to become vulnerable because of advances in cannon development, the knights also started becoming vulnerable and their authority started eroding. So this was a very interesting interplay of military and social developments. The cannon also gave rise to some early examples of what we later came to call standardization of parts. Until then, and for a long time even after that, military weapon making was really an artisanal industry. There were experts who learned the art of making weapons through sheer practice spread over several decades of their lifetime. And all the knowledge that they gained because of this practice was essentially in their heads. It wasn't really written down in a systematic manner. There were no blueprints, so to speak of, that described how to make weapons. And so it was a very, very individualized kind of art. There were two brothers in France called the Bureau brothers in the 13th or 14th century who really were the first ones to boil down the different designs of cannon into just a few designs that were efficient and that were true and tested over time. And this was probably the first example of standardization of parts, something that became extremely important after the Industrial Revolution. Now, I talked about how cannon, because of their ability to reduce a fortress down to ruins, really disrupted the social order as well as had an immediate impact on different battles and wars. But not surprisingly, the advent of cannon also led to the advent of developments in fortresses. And fortresses with triangular sharpened edges, for instance, which had cannons themselves situated on top of them that could be aimed at a garrison or that could be aimed at the enemy, also started to develop. So, for a long time, there was this arms race, if you will, between the development of cannon and the development of fortresses, until finally, when the cannon became so powerful that you couldn't really have a fortress that could withstand their concentrated fire. In spite of this, well into the 19th century, fortresses and forts were important, as those of us who are familiar with the American Civil War know. Places like Fort Donelson, for instance, or Fort Wilmington were very important in the war. And these were battered down by artillery in the end. But I just make that point to illustrate that fortresses did not disappear even when cannon became very important. Along with the development of artillery, lay a concomitant development in the manufacture of these cannons, and especially in the art and science of metal making. So a lot of the cannons in the early period were made out of cast iron, which had their own weaknesses. They couldn't withstand the high pressures that were developed during firing. Later cannon were made out of cast copper or cast bronze. Each came with its own set of strengths and weaknesses. But metal making and different technologies to shape and bend metal to your will, as well as rid metal of a lot of impurities, proved to be very crucial for the development of these weapons. The development of cannon led to another seminal development, that of the modern Navy. I think it's very clear from any reading of history that no European country would have succeeded in projecting its power abroad, and especially in its imperialistic and colonial ambitions, had it not had a powerful navy. By definition, it would have been impossible. And once the strength and power of cannon was noticed, it was a somewhat logical step to think of putting cannon on a ship. And cannon on a ship would be used not just to reduce um, defensive formations on the coast and defensive batteries, but it would also be used to destroy other enemy warships. So, in Lockhart's phrase, the cannon on a ship essentially turned the ship into a ship killing ship. And this was very important because this led to the formation of very large navies that could project strength across entire oceans. This obviously, like I said, led to a lot of colonialism, imperialism. This led to the establishment and development of Britain's colonies in the United States or in America at that time. And what was really fascinating, and Lockhart describes this really clearly in the book, what was really fascinating was that the development of the modern navy essentially led to the creation of the modern centralized bureaucratic state. More than any other military arm, certainly more than ragtag armies that existed in Europe at that time, the navy, just because of the sheer amount of material, the sheer amount of men, the sheer amount of tonnage that it needed, and obviously the sheer amount of money, could no longer be a local affair. It had to be created and maintained through the creation of a centralized bureaucratic state with civil servants and government officials being in charge of the material and the actions of the navy. This also led to a need for large cadres of trained trained sailors and trained Navy officials. So it also turned warfare from a system where you had small groups of soldiers training as per need to a large army in a country uh, that was dictated to by the king or the parliament, and this army was always ready to fight wars. So essentially, a standing army and a standing navy was the result of this huge expenditure and huge need for gunpowder and materials. So I think it was very interesting how he describes the creation of the modern navy as concomitant. Sorry, the creation of the modern bureaucratic state as concomitant with the creation of the modern navy. So once we get past the cannon and the fortresses and the navies, then we start talking about other weapons, including the longbow, which was quite decisive in the wars between England and France. But quite apart from these specific innovations, one thing I really like about the book is that Lockhart does not oversell their significance. Because after all, weapons are only as good as the countries and the men who command them and who wield them. And so, without a system of training, without a system of pay, without a system of retention of soldiers and sailors, weapons are not going to be of decisive use. And Lockhart does pay a lot of attention to the development of trained cadres of soldiers and all the important qualities that they need to have, including discipline and effectiveness, and most importantly, drill. I mean, the importance of drill can't be oversold. Until then, fights and battles could be very haphazard because soldiers were not really trained. They were kind of brought onto the battlefield on demand. And so there was no concept of year long training and year long drill, even in peacetime. And he talks about how, roughly beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries, some nations like Spain and Sweden pioneered the idea of drill, where every single man had to execute a certain number of actions all at the same time, and that was what made the men effective in a battle. Along with drill also came the existence of drill manuals. Until then, drill was again mostly like weapons designs. It was in the heads of individual officials and individual pioneers. It was never really made into a mass product, so to speak. And there were some key examples of military officials in Sweden and in the Netherlands who came up with the first manuals for drill. And these, of course, then later led to manuals for all other kinds of military weaponry and military tactics and so on. It also goes without saying that the dissemination of these manuals was greatly aided by the development of Gutenberg's printing press. And as printing spread across Europe, these manuals also spread in the 15th and 16th century. Unfortunately, and somewhat tragically, it also turns out that a lot of these developments were right on time for the religious wars that enveloped Europe after the Protestant Reformation. And so, as tragic as it sounds, this is also a story of religion and warfare and how those can be intertwined. Essentially, what happened is a lot of the developments in military hardware preceded or certainly were on the cusp of the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation brought along some terrible wars, terrible religious wars in Europe. You know, they had the Hundred Years' War well before the Protestant Reformation, but the 30 Years' War, which was in the 17th century, was largely a religious war that almost left all of Europe in ruins. And so all these weapons development, as well as the development of drill and the creation of training manuals, had a very effective role to play in the religious wars. And by effective, of course, I mean devastating, because it led to a lot of killing and destruction. But for better or worse, this is how things work. One system of technology, say, piggybacks on another economic or political system, and vice versa. We then come to small arms and handheld firearms. And interestingly, the development of small arms really proceeded in the opposite direction with respect relative to the development in cannons. So cannons actually went, like I said, from breech loading to muzzle. and they started now shrinking. And so, in a process that reminds us of the miniaturization of technology like computers, cannons actually started shrinking, and demand grew for better handheld weapons. And this led in the 17th and 18th century to matchlock muskets. So, guns which could be opened at the breech, where gunpowder was poured into the breech and the barrel. A lead ball or shot was inserted into the muzzle, it was tamped down tightly, and then a match actually lit the powder in a pan that was attached to the breech. And when it lit the powder in the pan on fire, that in fact that then ignited the powder in the barrel, which then pushed out the lead ball or shot with great velocity. This was the basic principle of any musket, any rifle during those times. Now, the matchlock musket had some disadvantages. First of all, it was a very cumbersome process lighting a match or a cord or a fuse and then lighting the powder in the pan. Uh, the important innovation that happened was when the matchlock musket became a flintlock musket. And the flintlock musket, as the name indicates, had a flint striking another metal piece at the breech, which led to series of sparks that then ignited the powder in the pan. And even this was cumbersome. Sometimes the powder would ignite without igniting the actual powder in the barrel. And this led to the well known English phrase, a flash in the pan. But most of the times it was much more effective compared to the matchlock musket. And so this was a great innovation. It played a very important role in the American Revolution. It kept on playing a role right into the 19th century, including the American Civil War. Lockhart also spends a lot of time talking about the development of automatic weapons, starting and pistols, starting with Hiram Maxim, who developed the very effective Maxim gun. Maxim was a very creative inventor. For some time, he had claims to the development of the incandescent light bulb, claim that quite did not hold up in the face of Edison's claims. But he is most famous as the development of the Maxim gun. And this, with its rapid rate of fire and very effective killing capacity, really caused a big transformation in warfare. A very important innovation as well was the development of the rifle. So you had muskets which were not very effective, they were not very long range and not very accurate. And you had lead balls that were bullets that were not very accurate. And both of these components changed with the advent of the rifle, which had bores inside the barrel and bullets which essentially fit very tightly into the bores and the barrel. Another big development was the invention of what is called the mini ball. So this is actually a bullet with skirts or folds at the bottom. And what happens is it fits very tightly inside a rifled musket, or a rifle as we would call it now. And when the hot gases created by the ignition of the powder propel the bullet forward, it actually flattens the base. And this leads to a very effective push that takes the bullet much farther than what it would otherwise. It also creates a lot of ugly destruction when it enters a man's body because of its flattened nature. And mini balls became quite common in the American Civil War. In fact, you can find them on eBay because there were so many of them used that they still lie undisturbed in many cases on the battlefields of the Civil War. So I'm not going to talk about every single other military innovation that Lockhart describes, but he takes us all the way through the development of ironclad naval warships, for instance, much better artillery, timed fuses and charges, explosive charges and incendiary charges that would essentially be timed to explode over enemy territory or inside another ship on demand. And obviously, all of these instruments of destruction caused a lot of damage. He takes us then through the the Franco-Prussian conflict, the war between Germany and France in 1870 that was started by Bismarck, which led to a lot of military tactics, including the formation of a very disciplined German army. And this disciplined German army was to have a decisive role, as we know, in both World War I and World War II. And Germany, in both of those wars, really lost the war not because of a lack of discipline or a lack of intelligence, but really a lack of resources and a lack of unity because there were so many allied countries fighting against her. The advent of World War I and World War II also saw the advent of extremely effective killing weapons like the tank, which was a game changer, as well as the machine gun. Lockhart doesn't quite talk about chemical weapons and biological weapons, but chemical weapons, as is well known, uh, had a devastating psychological effect on soldiers in World War I. Although it did not lead to a lot of casualties, it still had a very big psychological effect. Lockhart ends his narrative at the end of World War II with the advent of the fighter and the bomber. This led to a misunderstanding among the newly developed air forces that bombing alone could win a war. And so they carried out very devastating large scale civilian bombing campaigns against Dresden and Hamburg and Tokyo and so on. And that was not really what turned out to be the case. It was still conventional weapons, conventional armies that were supported by the Air Force and by fighters and bombers that led to victory in World War II. Lockhart ends his book at the end of World War II, and that seems to be a logical place to culminate the narrative because that's when a single plane carrying a single bomb destroyed an entire city, the city of Hiroshima, that was destroyed by an atomic bomb in August 1945. And atomic bombs, in Lockhart's views, are just the culmination of a very long series of military innovations, piggybacking on economic and political developments and political innovations, including the creation of the modern bureaucratic state. And atomic weapons really completely changed the nature of warfare from just a quantitative step up to something completely new. As the physicist Niels Bohr said, they actually put us in a situation that could no longer be resolved by war because statesmen and politicians knew that a war fought with atomic weapons would be the last war that any country would ever fight. So, in summary, I would highly recommend Paul Lockhart's book, Firepower: How Weapons Shaped Warfare. It's certainly of great interest to specialists and military history buffs, but because of the interplay it describes between specific military hardware and weapons and political and economic and social systems, I think that's what really makes the book stand apart, makes a lot of the narrative quite fascinating and of very broad interest going beyond just people interested in military history. So I highly recommend Paul Lockhart's Firepower.